Welcome back, Chappelle. All right, welcome back to it. Really excited that y'all made it back safe and sound from your retreat. Not all at once, but you still made it back, right? So, like, after seeing Megan Mueller and Cameron Kennedy sitting on the, the pavement outside, I think it was just like a little bit of a awesome experience. Intense getting back, right? Now, like, the biggest thing about it, though, is I'm so happy that y'all got a chance to do that. But remember, we are still, like, in the middle of a really intense unit, right? We're still in the middle of a really intense unit. It's going to be kind of a tough test and stuff like that. It's going to be okay, though. But let's make sure we're going to start studying sooner rather than later. I'm going to go ahead and post your study guide this weekend. Start working on it now, right? Because Napoleon's going to be on there. The Industrial Revolution's going to be on there. And another big thing that's going to be on there is the thing that we're about to talk about in this flip right now. So you have to understand when we're looking at the French Revolution, of course, the thing that lasted from 1789 all the way up until 1815, everybody wonders, like, oh my God, I feel like this class, Western Civ, is not actually just like a survey course. I feel as though it's just like a French Revolution class. Well, you know what? Okay, for all of y'all saying that, you have to understand the French Revolution is a massively important event. It has ramifications on the entire world during the 1800s, okay? So going into it, let's go ahead and talk about the major thing that we're going to be actually like talking about as in its worldwide effects. So we're going to be looking today specifically at the Haitian Revolution, right? As in how the colony that was once French is going to become an independent nation now referred to as Haiti, right? So looking at this, getting into it, you have to understand, if we wanted to, we could talk about multiple of the different Latin American revolutions. As you can see right here, the Latin American independence movements was a massive movement that happened during the 1800s as a result of the French Revolution and all the calamity that it caused in Europe. But looking at it, we could talk about Bolivar, we could talk about San Martin, we could talk about Toussaint Louverture, we could talk about a lot of stuff, but we're going to focus on Haiti to use it as an example. Now, to give you a background of which you already probably copied this down. I know Maddie Wynn like screenshotted it in her flip, which was really bright and very, very smart. Looking at this entire understanding, you need to understand, looking at it, that South America and the Caribbean are going to have that big background we've already talked about, right? The Maya, the Aztec, the Inca were there. The heavy colonizers of these two areas are going to be Spain, Portugal, and France. And of course, the movements going on in Europe are going to lead to them becoming independent countries. You had the English Revolution, which led to the Enlightenment. You had the Enlightenment that led to the American Revolution. You, of course, had the American Revolution that led to the French Revolution. And the French Revolution is then going to lead to Latin American independence movements and also self-determination in Europe. So some of you are saying, well, like self-determination in Europe and Latin American independence, is that the same thing? No, it's not, okay? We have to talk about this now so you understand it later, that self-determination is the process by which a country or cultural group determines its own statehood and forms its own allegiances in government. What I mean by that is basically like, instead of having an Austro-Hungarian empire that includes places that speak all kinds of languages, you're going to have some of those groups of people that are going to decide that they want to be their own country. So places like Serbia are going to be like, wait a minute, we don't speak German. We should be our own country. So they decide to actually form their own country in a movement of self-determination. Now, this is very key difference to the fact that places like the Austro-Hungarian Empire had too many ethnic groups and cultures in too few countries, whereas the major difference between that going on in Europe and these Latin American liberation movements is the fact that these Latin Americans were colonies set up by those Europeans. And what's going to happen is the conquests of Napoleon are going to lead to those countries deciding and demanding that they now feel as culturally different and they want to create their own countries. So the place we're going to focus on is not Bolivia, not Venezuela, not Ecuador. We could talk about the Mexican Revolution that actually lasted for over 100 years. The one we're going to focus on is the French colony that you now refer to as Haiti, right? So looking at it, you got to understand first and foremost where Haiti is in the grand scheme of things. Where is it on a map, okay? So looking at it right here, this is where modern-day Haiti is, this dark green on this half of an island. So looking at it, there is Florida, the Bahamas are over here, there is Cuba, Jamaica, and Haiti is located right there. So Haiti did not always used to be called Haiti, and also, as you can tell, Haiti shares its island with someone else. So the island that Haiti sits on is called Hispaniola. Do me a favor and write that down, okay? Hispaniola. Hispaniola, Hispanola, is the name of the island that Haiti sits on top of, and it shares that island with the current-day Dominican Republic. Now, it is only called Haiti because of the liberation movement that occurred there. It was actually called, while it was under French control, Saint-Domingue. All right, so Saint-Domingue was actually what Haiti used to be called when it was a French colony. And on the right side, there was a Spanish colony right there called Santo Domingo. So you got to understand that this little key factor right here, that it was a French colony on this side and a Spanish colony on this side, is going to play into the geopolitics going forward and to the understanding of this entire part of the flip that we're about to talk about. Now, looking at the colony of Saint-Domingue, that was a French colony under Catholic rule by French monarchs and things like that ever since the 1700s. Started out originally as an outpost for pirates. The French government is actually going to encourage those pirates to settle there. Pirates are going to start farming two things: coffee and sugarcane. Now, Haiti's crops and its agriculture is going to be so successful that it's actually going to lead to a massive plantation economy. Sugar and coffee plantations would spring up all over the colony and make the French government a ridiculous sum of money. Now, plantations like those produced 40% of the world's sugar and 60% of the world's coffee. So looking at Haiti and understanding that originally when it was called Saint-Domingue, when it was a French colony, looking at the colony of Saint-Domingue was very, very profitable, right? Especially for the French monarchs. But it was a plantation economy. And the disgusting thing about a plantation economy is the fact that the use of the, let me rephrase. The disgusting thing about a plantation economy is the fact that the people that are producing all that coffee and sugar are slaves. So during this time period, a heavy amount of slaves were brought in to the Caribbean. A lot of that has to do with the fact that what would end up happening is most slaves would end up dying by the time they had lived there for about 5 years. So the heavy amount of slave population that existed in the Caribbean was first generation African, or has come originally from Africa. They would end up dying a lot due to overwork, disgusting treatment, and disease. So there were heavy amounts of diseases going on in the Caribbean, like yellow fever and malaria, that killed a lot of the slaves that were being brought from Africa. So going into it, that means that you have a very, very young population, mid-30s of these slaves, and then also, since there's such a heavy influx of them to replace the ones that are passing away due to disease, you have a large slave population there. Basically, what I'm getting at in this sense is that you had a young slave population that outnumbered its captors 6-1. So for every 6 slaves that existed in the colony of Saint-Domingue, there was one white person, or white colonial, or European. So looking at it though, also, just a little backstory as well, Haiti to this day is also known as a place that produces almost the most, the second most professional athletes in the United States per capita, which is insane because that's Pierre Garçon, he's a receiver for the NFL, and then also LeBron James is half Haitian. So looking at this understanding of this entire event and understanding of this entire colony and the understanding of everything going forward is that during the 1700s, before the revolution in France ever even started, there was already a history of slave upheaval. So what I'm getting at is saying that the society there was so bad and the treatment of these people was so poor, and that basically in the long run, these slaves began to violently demand their freedom, as they should have. Even before the French Revolution, slaves were running away and dying in revolts in very high numbers. Now, a lot of that also, again, relates to the fact that a lot of these slaves were heavily male, and they were also very young, and they were in a very, they were very able to actually assemble each other together and actually have these revolts. So what's going to happen is, or what you're going to notice going forward, is that the unfortunate thing for these slave revolts is that they weren't organized. And they weren't organized, and we could see that in the fact that once certain slaves would actually escape these plantation confinements, a lot of times they would run away into the mountains, because Haiti is actually covered in mountains off the coastline. So when you get past the coastline, the mountains show up in the actual current day country of Haiti, formerly Saint-Domingue. So slaves are going to establish these maroons all over the mountains, because once they freed themselves from the control of their captors, they then went out and founded basically little camps and cities together where they would actually live there together. The problem is that's 1 or 2 slaves individually from each plantation. What we want to see happen is the entire plantation setup in this colony to go away and the freedom of all these people. So the thing that they needed more than anything else was leadership. Now, looking at it, though, a lot of this violence is caused by the fact that Saint-Domingue had a very unusual class system, and that they didn't have anyone to lead these slave revolts because the class system placated some, kept a lot of people wealthy, and then also kept some other people very, very, very in bondage. So going into it, that right there is the class system that was going on in the colony of Saint-Domingue. So let's look at this thing in a broad spectrum. One, first and foremost, it's not a triangle, it's a square. Reason why it's a square is due to the fact that, like, two of these classes are similar in wealth and also similar in land holdings, and the other two on the bottom are considered like the lower classes. So it's split left to right by race. So on the left side, you have people of African descent, and on the people of right side, you have the people of European descent. So let's focus first and foremost on the two wealthy groups up at the top. So the first one on the right are the people that owned most of the plantations that actually existed in Saint-Domingue. They were the wealthy white planters known as the Grand Blancs. Now, Grand Blancs made up about 10,000 people in the Saint-Domingue society, but the thing about it is most of them don't even live there. Most of them lived back in France, and they actually just profited off of all of the work of the slaves that actually worked on these plantations, right? So these Grand Blancs lived back in France, and looking at the entire understanding is that they didn't care what happened, they didn't care how many slave revolts occurred, as long as they were still making their money. Now, looking on the bottom, you had white laborers, okay? The Petit Blancs, which is about 30,000 of them that lived on the island. These 30,000 Petit Blancs usually were shippers and traders and artisans and people that worked on the boats and at the docks. They were workers, right? So the thing about it is, like, these white laborers, these Petit Blancs, had a lot of rights and still had a lot more rights than this group, okay? So these two groups heavily do not like one another. The free people of color, also known as the affranchis, which actually means, like, the free people of color, which is about 20,000 of them. Why is there such a large population of free people of color in a colony that is actually, like, pretty much propped up and held up by slavery? Well, I'll tell you why. That's a great question. The biggest reason why is because most of the French colonizers that were showing up in Saint-Domingue were single men. Since they were single men and there was a heavy amount of African slave women there, a lot of people were born of mixed race. During this time period, people would be referred to, literally, societally speaking, again, this is a word that we do not use in common society, but their class system is they were referred to as being mulatto because they were of mixed European and African descent. And what would happen is the, like, white father would release the child from slavery. So you had a large population of free people of color or mixed race. Also, another little fact about this as well is that you have to understand is that since it was a Catholic colony, and since France was a Catholic colony, they did not let people work on Sundays. Since they don't let people work on Sundays, that means what's going to end up happening is that some slaves are going to work on Sundays anyway for pay or be contracted out by their masters, and then they would eventually buy their freedom. So this free people of color class is a very, very interesting one, and we'll actually, like, understand them a little bit better because they're actually kind of going to take over, like, control of the slave, like, revolts going on and help lead Haiti into, like, independence and also lead them to a society with no slavery at all. So slaves, though, do make up the 90% of the population in Saint-Domingue of about 500,000. Now, these slaves would lead very different lives plantation to plantation. So, like, for example, if you lived on a plantation that was led by a good, kind person, your upbringing could be very, very different if you lived on one that was, like, violent, aggressive, and extremely ignorant. So, going forward, we'll see that again a little bit later as well when we talk about two very, very key different leaders. The one of them we're about to get into here in about 2 seconds. Now, the French Revolution, though, is going to explode in 1789, and what's going to happen is the slaves on the plantations are going to begin to hear rumors that the King of France has liberated them and freed them. So this is going to lead to an explosion of more slave revolts. Now, what's going to happen is that revolt in 1789 that started off was another one that, like, kind of blew up and then fizzled out again. Reason why it fizzled out, because the revolt was led by a lot of these free people of color who wanted more rights, and they wanted to be able to own more land, and they also wanted to be able to legally vote. So what's going to happen is the new government under the National Assembly in France is going to give these free people of color, the affranchis, the right to legally vote, and then also is going to give them the right to own slaves as well, which is going to be a big thing that's going to keep this Band-Aid solution on this bad social class system. Well, in 1789, after the very first slave revolt broke out and fizzled out because of the rights given to these affranchis or these free people of color, another man is going to step up and lead the slave revolt of 1791, and his name is Toussaint Louverture. Toussaint Louverture is one of the most important figures in Western civilization's history because he is going to be the only man that leads a slave-based society in a revolt to have an independent society all of their own, and one where he will have slavery abolished in this colony. So to give you some backstory about Toussaint Louverture, he was a former slave himself. He is one of the people that was actually freed by his slave owner. And the reason why is because his slave owner actually took a liking to him in the sense of he believed that Toussaint was very intelligent and he thought that he was going to be a great man one day, so he decided to actually teach him how to read, teach him how to write, and then he also educated him in Enlightenment principles and would eventually free him. So as a part of this, Toussaint would later on go on to keep reading and writing and educate himself in the ways of the Enlightenment, also in the ways of thinking, and also in the ways of military practice. Reason why is because in this original slave revolt that broke out in 1789, Toussaint Louverture served as a field doctor. He would actually help keep a lot of these slaves that were fighting in this revolt alive and actually bandage them up and keep them from dying. He noticed during this 1789 revolt, the one that resulted in the free people of color getting the right to legally vote and own slaves, he noticed that the biggest problem about the slave revolts is that they would never keelly work if they weren't organized. So he decided to take control of another slave revolt that's going to break out in 1791, and he organizes the men. He organizes the slaves. He helps teach them Napoleonic warfare tactics and blends guerrilla warfare tactics with the ways that he wants them to fight. He gives his officers uniforms, and he creates a system of trained versus untrained soldiers and leadership, and he takes over this slave revolt that had 100,000 people in it and decides it is not enough to give free people of color more rights. What we want on this island is freedom for every person. And so he decides that he has one goal in the slave revolt of 1791 in Saint-Domingue. He wants slavery abolished. So what he's going to do is he's going to start leading this revolt throughout all of Haiti. He takes over northern Haiti, and he begins to get close to the mountains that actually border Haiti, Saint-Domingue and Santo Domingo, the Spanish colony on the right side of Hispaniola. Now, there's an interesting little thing that happens in this sense. The French are freaking out, right? They're having a revolution, and one of their colonies is rebelling in 1791. Then what's going to happen is they're flipping out. They don't know what to do. And then they're like, well, maybe we can convince this guy Toussaint Louverture to stop. Turns out you're not going to be able to convince him of anything. Reason why? Because he joined up with the Spanish. He said, I renounce any French citizenship that I may have. And he became an officer in the Spanish military. Now, why would the Spanish want to do this? Because they like the idea of Toussaint Louverture liberating that left side of the island, and then the Spanish being able to come in and take it over and use the colonies to themselves, even if they aren't allowed to use slavery in that area. So the Spanish told Toussaint Louverture, oh, don't be French, be Spanish. We'll commission you as an officer in our military, and then we'll also abolish slavery on that side of the island. How's that sound for you? Toussaint Louverture agrees, joins up with the Spanish. So the National Assembly decides to try to figure out a way to keep Toussaint Louverture on their sides after a 3-year-long slave revolt, and they decide to abolish slavery. Maximilien Robespierre, the evil man that he was, did decide to abolish slavery to get Toussaint Louverture to come back to the French side, right? And it works, and he does that. But what has just happened is the most mind-blowing event. Toussaint Louverture has gotten slavery abolished in the colony of Saint-Domingue and has liberated the people that he sought out to liberate. That is an amazing triumph and an amazing feat by a man that was a former slave himself, right? So getting into it, though, this right here is an actual image or a painting of Toussaint Louverture after his famous campaign where he led that slave revolt of 1791 to 1794 and got the people of Saint-Domingue liberated, right? Now, the cool thing that's going to happen is he's going to set up an economic style, and he's actually a very good politician, and he creates a system where all of the people that are on this island, yes, are still producing coffee and sugar, and they're doing it for the French, but they're now being paid. And they're now liberated, and they are now allowed to freely move throughout society. And another big thing is he did this all with a guy right next to him by the name of Jean-Jacques Dessalines, which is another man that was a former slave himself, and he was Toussaint Louverture's right-hand man, his general that served with him in all of these battles. And the society began to progress, and from 1794 to about, give or take, 1803, Haiti was doing fine, right? So Saint-Domingue was doing great and was making money, and they were progressing forward. But then this jerk is going to come into the picture. That's right. Napoleon takes over France in 1802 and in 1799. And one of the biggest things that Napoleon wants to do is he wants to recreate his old empire over in North America. He wants more land in what used to be like what is now like the United States and the French territory of Louisiana. He wants to bring slavery back to Saint-Domingue. So he accuses Toussaint Louverture of planning another uprising, which was not true at all. And then he lands troops in Saint-Domingue in 1802, showing up to actually retake the island and try to make these people be slaves again. Napoleon, what the heck? You're one of the biggest pieces of garbage in all of European history. So what's going to end up happening is he actually convinces Toussaint Louverture. Napoleon's not there. He sends an officer there named, I think his name's like Ma. It's like something like Ma Poisson. So it's something with an M, and I can never remember what it is. So what happens is that man tells Toussaint Louverture to come to a meeting. That meeting turned out to be a trap. They actually arrested Toussaint Louverture, put him on a boat, and shipped him to the French Alps. Ripped him away from his family, and Toussaint Louverture would die in prison in the Alps 10 months later in April 1803. You took a man from the Caribbean who led his people in that climate to liberation, and you locked him up in one of the coldest places in the entire world. Napoleon, you're awful. I hate you. But remember what I said. On his right-hand side, or on his right-hand man, Jean-Jacques Dessalines would take over when Toussaint Louverture actually got arrested, and he was Toussaint's general. And he decided to become the brutal tactician that he would become. Now, Jean-Jacques Dessalines is an interesting figure because he's going to help lead Haiti to complete independence. But the thing about it is that Jean-Jacques Dessalines was a brutal man in and of himself, right? He was so furious after Toussaint Louverture was actually abducted and then arrested and then shipped off to the Alps that he is now rising up and filling in that power vacuum in that area that is being left behind. But Jean-Jacques was a lot different from Toussaint. Toussaint's master that actually owned the plantation where Toussaint was born was a good man and taught Toussaint to read and write and freed him. Jean-Jacques Dessalines was born on an actual sugar plantation where he had a master that was brutal. And he had slaves executed and punished and whipped and beaten. And so Jean-Jacques Dessalines as a young man witnessed all of these things. So when he took over in Toussaint's stead, he said, we will now do to these people what they did to so many slaves on this island. And he had a lot of people massacred that were left behind. But in January 1st, 1804, he did also declare Haiti an independent country and used guerrilla warfare and the aid of disease because it destroyed a lot of the French armies. Yellow fever killed a lot of the French troops. But he's going to use these methods to liberate Haiti. And he was also a good politician, and he was looking out for his people, so it's kind of really hard to call him an awful person, but at the same time, he had a very, very aggressive way of doing it. And he, does create the very first black colony to free itself from European control. So it's the second colony ever to revolutionize from Europe. He becomes the very first emperor of Haiti. He would later be assassinated in a revolt. But by 1820, Haiti becomes an independent republic with democratic elections. So that right there is an understanding of how the French Revolution is going to lead even one of their colonies to liberate itself. And this movement would sweep all of South America. Simon Bolivar would lead the upper area of South America to liberation. Jose de San Martin would lead the southern area of South America to liberation. And so as you can see, the French Revolution caused so much chaos in North and South America that a lot of these places that were colonies of Spain and France are going to decide, no more of this, we want to be our own countries. And that right there is the big thing about the Haitian Revolution that we're going to talk about. We'll review it heavily on Monday. I know it's a little bit of a confusing topic, but I got y'all. I'll see y'all soon. Y'all have a good one.